Excellent. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking times out of your busy schedule to join us today. Uh, Eid Mubarak to anyone who's celebrating. My name is Sam Putnam. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm director of the Byrne-Dibner Library at New York University. And I'm also a member of the Science and Technology Section Scholarly Communications Committee. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our webinar, Developing Inclusive Identity Practices in Academic Publishing and Beyond, with Dr. Teresa Tanenbaum. Before we move on to introductions, I want to extend a big thank you to the Science and Technology section and also the University Library section of ACRL for sponsoring this webinar. I want to give a big thank you to the STS Scholarly Communications Committee, the STS Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and the ULS Communications Committee for collaborating on this important program. And just as a little note, I love to see this sort of cross-section collaboration at ACRL, so it's been a fun process to help coordinate this. Over the past 5 years, there's been a sea change in perceptions and policies on name change policies across academic publishing. This change is due in large part to the incredible work of activists, advocates, and academics who formed working groups, lobbied publishers, wrote op-eds, just to name a few, in order to push through this necessary change to make academic publishing more inclusive. And today, we're excited to have one of those advocates with us, Dr. Teresa Jean Tanenbaum. Dr. Teresa Jean Tanenbaum, or Tess, as she told me to, or as she often goes by. I don't think you ever actually officially told me to call you that. But
yes, no, please do call me Tess.
Okay. Is a game designer, artist, activist, and associate professor in the Department of Informatics at UC Irvine, where she's a founding member of the Transformative Play Lab. Dr. Tanenbaum's work is playful, provocative, and interdisciplinary, frequently straddling the line between art, design, and research. Her work seeks to create possibilities for social and individual change, using participatory narrative to highlight how the identities that we inhabit in the world are contingent and negotiated. These experiences of transformative theatrical play create possibility models that are emancipatory, allowing oppressed and marginalized people to inhabit new identities that create possibilities where there were none before, and reclaim power and agency denied to them. An experienced game designer, Tessa's work incorporates physical objects, wearable technology, and interactive tabletops to explore embodied interactions with digital games and stories. She's developed new gaming technologies that push the boundaries of personal fabrication. Her recent work also explores the intersection of live performance and mixed reality, augmented reality, and virtual reality technologies. Dr. Tanenbaum has been instrumental in helping create new, more inclusive policies within the academic publishing world that make it possible for people to correct their names on previously published scholarship. Tess is currently transitioning again, this time out of academia and into a full-time career as a composer, storyteller, speaker, and activist. She's currently taking on clients for her consulting practice and is putting the finishing touches on her autobiographical musical about gender transition and marriage during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is almost like the last performance in some ways as an academic for Tess. And so without further ado, I'm incredibly excited to introduce Dr. Tess Tanenbaum.
Thank you so much, Sam. So yeah, I'm Tess Tanenbaum. I'm really excited to actually get a chance to talk to this community today, and to dig into the nuts and bolts of what we have done in our advocacy for name change work and inclusive identity practices. I have some bio slides that I feel like have already been covered by Sam's extraordinary introduction, but I'm still going to go through them. So yes, I am an outgoing associate professor in the Department of Informatics at UC Irvine. I have about 8 weeks left before I take my year leave, that then will transition into a new career. I run a multidisciplinary group where we create and evaluate experiences of what I like to call transformative play. And I am by training and practice a storyteller. I use a combination of computational narrative techniques and theatrical production elements to create participatory narrative experiences. These often combine digital and physical elements and usually involve role play or performance or other forms of structured enactment. And while much of my research is quite playful on the surface, It's also designed to, at some level, engage with more serious questions of identity. Who do we get to be in the world? What identities are permitted or denied to us? How does it feel to take on another role or perspective? How do we design to facilitate perspective taking? It is from this perspective that my interest in identity infrastructures and name change policies begins to fit into this bigger picture. Now, I view equity and justice as design poetics for the work that I do. And while this has been implicit within all of the work that I do, it has only been over the last 4 years that this has become a central and explicit focus of my scholarship and service. Uh, this is because issues of equity, especially as they pertain to questions of identity, have taken on a personal urgency in my life since coming out as a transgender woman in 2019 and changing my name. This has led me to devote a significant amount of my life over the past almost 4 years now to advocating for trans-inclusive name change policies within scholarly publishing. I've been working with the Association of Computing Machinery and a group called Names for Life to help conceive of and build and assess new inclusive identity infrastructures built around what we call persistent identifiers. Now, when doing this kind of work, there were two big hurdles that I faced when I sought to correct my own name in my previous work. The first is that not all publishers recognized the necessity and importance of making these changes in an accessible, comprehensive, private, timely, and sustainable way. Uh, the second is that publishers were not prepared to make these changes from a practical standpoint. In the almost 4 years that I've been working on this problem, I've been fortunate enough to be able to make significant progress on clearing this first hurdle. But the second hurdle remains a pretty significant challenge. In this talk, I'm going to be reflecting on the personal circumstances that led to me taking on this work. I'll discuss the work I've been doing with authors, publishers, and other stakeholders. And I'm going to go into a considerable amount of what we call nuts and bolts detail about how I've been doing this work, because I think it's important to model successful practices of advocating for institutional change around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And then I will close by considering some of the implications for the future of how we think about our digital identities. And in order to explain how the name change policy working group that I co-founded came to be, I need to first tell you a story about my own experiences transitioning and choosing a new name for myself. Now, choosing a new name as a trans person, it can be both profoundly affirming and also extremely intimidating. Like, how many people get to choose this for themselves? It's a lot to consider. Do I want a name that's easy to pronounce? Do I want a name that's easy to spell? Do I want a name that's easy to remember? Did I want a short name or a long one? Should it mean something special? I love that Teresa means the Reaper, actually. I considered all of these things and more. I thought about search engine optimization. I thought about whether there were other Teresa Tanenbaums in the world. I thought about ease of writing and signing the name when I signed it. It's a pretty fraught situation. What is your name going to say about you? How is it going to affect how you interface with other people socially? And in the same way that my wife and I deliberated over our daughter's name for the months leading up to her birth, I found myself walking around with this list of names in my pocket that I was auditioning and trying out. Maybe I was a Josie. Maybe I was a Hannah. Did I take a family name? Do I take a name that is similar to my old masculine one so that I can make my transition more comfortable for the people around me, make it easier for them to remember? Hoping to not have to make this decision on my own, I actually reached out to my mother to see what she would have called me if she'd known that I was a girl when I was born. But if she had picked out any girl names for me, she hadn't remembered any of them, and she wasn't actually going to be any help with this. It meant that I had to make this decision for myself. Now, this is a kind of privilege granted to very few of us, and one of the many aspects of the trans experience that I find actually quite empowering and beautiful. It's one that I didn't want to mess up. I didn't want to have to go through this process another time. Now, my process of coming out was haphazard. I didn't plan it. I know people who plan it very meticulously, but for me, the tipping point in my professional community was in 2019 at the ACM Designing Interactive Systems Conference. Now, at that point, I'd been slowly adopting a more gender non-conforming style and presentation, but I hadn't really explained what was going on to anyone. I hadn't really contextualized why I looked different outside of a small circle of people who I trusted. At DIS, I took a leap that I had been anxious about for months. I left home and left all of my masculine attire at home. And actually I showed up with no clothes, went to a thrift shop, purchased a new wardrobe, and attended the conference on femme, except for my beard and my, at that point, unchanged name. I also took what felt like an enormous leap for myself at the time. Excuse me. And I asked for new pronouns, she, her, or they, them, prominently called out on stickers on my conference badge. Now, I'd never dared to request she, her pronouns before, and while I desperately wanted people to see and acknowledge this about me, I also felt like I was imposing on the people around me, that I was asking them all to humor me. And this is how I found myself in a dress in the hotel lobby, chatting with my friend and colleague Elizabeth Churchill, who was at this point the vice president of the Association for Computing Machinery. She said to me, the ACM is trying to figure out how to handle author name changes, but we've been stuck for the last year. And she kind of looked at my clothing and said, is that something you're going to be interested in? And I allowed that I had been thinking about this, but that I didn't yet know if or when I'd change my name. And she asked if I'd like to be added into the conversation, and I agreed. Now, my experience of being out at DIS showed me that I could be out and trans in my professional world and not be a pariah. And so even though I still felt a lot of imposter syndrome, even though I didn't feel like I had a right to call myself trans, let alone a woman, I threw caution to the wind and I came out on July 4th of 2019. I declared it was my Independence Day. By this time, I had the first piece of my new name, Tess. My full legal name, Teresa Jean Tanenbaum, I hadn't yet figured out. That would come later. Now, being called by my new name and pronouns, especially at the beginning, was one of the most profound joys of my early transition. Tess Tanenbaum felt like a superhero's secret identity to me, or like the hero from a pulp detective story or a noir thriller. It was also a reference to my daughter's middle name, Tesla, which my wife and I had picked specifically because we thought Tess Tanenbaum was such a great nickname. And my daughter had no interest in that name, so I got it. It was very lovely. After living for decades with a name that had made me feel wrong and invisible, having a name that felt like me was intoxicating. And so it wasn't long before my relationship with my old name became somewhat fraught. Now, the term that many trans people use to describe their previous name is dead name, although I prefer necronym. And the longer I was out, the more accurate that word started to feel. Where I had been relatively sanguine about my dead name at the beginning of my transition, it soon became a source of real trauma and pain for me. And as a fairly successful junior scholar, my dead name was everywhere in my professional life. It was this ghost of my former self that was rattling my chains and demanding to be finally allowed to rest in peace. Now, at this point, I knew that I would be going up for tenure in a year, and I was concerned about this. The idea of my dead name being broadcast across my tenure materials made me physically ill. I didn't want the tenure committee to be focused on my transness or my gender identity. I wanted them to be able to focus on my professional accomplishments. I also didn't want my bibliometrics to be impacted by the fact that I'd changed my name, so much so that I actually briefly considered taking a new name that shared initials with my previous first and middle names in the hopes that I'd be able to ease the process of retaining credit for my previous publications. The idea of being dead named throughout my tenure case made me so uncomfortable that I set out to change my name on as many of my previously published works as possible. Now, at the time, I naively thought that publishers must have pre-existing pathways for people to change their names. After all, many people, most often women in our society, change their names at marriage or divorce. But what I found surprised me. Not a single one of the 15 venues where my work was published had any formal policy or process for changing the name on a paper after publication. In fact, in 2019, when I started this work, there wasn't a single major publisher who explicitly permitted authors to change their names on previously published works. A few of the smaller conferences I attended allowed me to do ad hoc name changes, but it was all on a case-by-case basis at that point. So, new name in hand, I reached out to the ACM people about the working group that Elizabeth had invited me to and asked them to start correcting my name on my publications. I was added to this group that included 3 other trans and non-binary colleagues, as well as members drawn from the ACM publication staff, who oversaw the day-to-day operations of the digital library, and several members of the ACM Publications Board who oversaw matters of publication policy for the association. In 2019, it was quite unprecedented for 4 relatively junior transgender scholars to find themselves with a seat at the table, helping to shape a policy that would impact a platform as large and as pervasive as the ACM Digital Library, especially when there was no precedent for this policy within the publishing world. Now, the ACM, to their very great credit, had acknowledged that it might, be possible to change the names of trans people on previous publications, but they were quite cagey about it. Um, and it was very clear to us that the people making the decisions about the policy needed our perspective because we understood the ongoing harms of the current status quo in a way that very few of them did, that very few cis people do typically. We understood that when a platform discloses the dead name of a trans person, especially in a way that juxtaposes it with their correct name, they also disclose the gender identity of that person. And this is no different than a platform revealing the sexuality or the religious convictions of a person without their consent. Violations of privacy that I think most people would agree are inappropriate to happen inside of a publishing platform. Now, even as I was starting to discover exactly how challenging it would be to create an inclusive policy at the ACM, I was also facing similar situations at many of the other publishers where I was seeking to change my name. And the central problem that I was encountering was that even editors and publishers who were sympathetic to my requests saw correcting the record as humoring an author at best and violating the historical record at worst. Now, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's an important one to me, which is that this adherence to the notion of some sort of like sacrosanct historical record kind of fails to understand the many ways in which this record is a construct constituted by our ongoing collective negotiations around what is and isn't a meaningful contribution to the project of scholarship. The historical record, of necessity, is a curated archive. As a community, we agree that certain information merits preservation and other information doesn't. Scholars of archives, of which I suspect we have quite a few in this group, recognize that the task of maintaining the information we've chosen to preserve is a dynamic and ongoing one, involving continuous transformation across different platforms, different standards, different cultural norms. The so-called historical record is a living thing that we all collectively tend to and nurture to advance the project of knowledge production and preservation. Insisting on the sanctity of some sort of static, fixed, idealized historical record sort of fundamentally misunderstands the very nature of such a thing. And so I spent much of 2019 learning everything I could about the perspectives of publishers, the legal constraints that they were working with, and the needs of trans people, especially trans people of color and trans people outside of North America and Europe who might want to change their names. I reached out to a lot of people, had a lot of conversations. And over the course of many long negotiations with the publishers of my work and long conversations with other trans people, I honed my knowledge and my arguments in favor of name change policies. The first and most critical piece of this argument was to properly frame the problem. Denying transgender authors the ability to change their names within their publication record is a form of discrimination that produces ongoing active harm. Now, I set out to enumerate these harms in ways that I hoped the publishers I was negotiating with could understand. These are the harms that the publishing world was causing by refusing to correct previous publications. Violations of privacy, when trans people are subjected to increased harassment, discrimination, and violence when their identities are disclosed. Denial of credit. Leaving names unchanged means that the scholarship of trans authors is no longer correctly attributed to them and exposes them to greater precarity in academic review processes. Denial of dignity. Dead naming causes trauma. It dehumanizes trans people, denies the validity of their identity. And of course, ongoing corrective epistemic labor. Uncorrected papers incur ongoing corrective labor for publishers and authors. Now, I can return to these harms and unpack them in greater detail if anybody wants me to, and I have slides for them. But I'm going to operate here under the assumption that because I've been invited to give this particular talk in this moment, that I'm presenting to a mostly sympathetic audience. And so instead of belaboring these points, I'm going to sort of return back to the nuts and bolts of how this working group came to be formed. Now, returning to my time with the ACM name change policy working group, we spent several months sort of patiently educating the ACM staff and publications board about the importance of correcting the record. We were faced with significant skepticism. The ACM people excelled at coming up with new bad ideas. They proposed correcting the metadata in the ACM digital library, but not the PDF documents associated with it. And we pointed out how this would be confusing to readers and would disclose our gender identities, causing the harms that we enumerated previously. They proposed marking every entry that had been updated with a visible disclaimer in the digital library. And we pointed out how this would stigmatize papers and risk disclosing our gender identities. They proposed only permitting name changes after being shown proof of a legal name change, and we pointed out how this would discriminate against authors who didn't have access to legal name changes. Plenty of people, based simply on where they were born, are unable to access a legal name change. They proposed only allowing name changes in the case of gender transition. And we pointed out how this would put them into the position of having to police gender identity and how impractical it would be for them to try and determine who was trans enough to deserve a name change. Progress was slow, but in September of 2019, the four of us persuaded the working group to allow us to draft the new name change policy. And over the Rosh Hashanah weekend, I sat down with Phoebe and Kata, connected over Slack, and working in a shared Google Doc, we hashed out the details. Our initial draft was a comprehensive document, but the ACM Publications Board and staff felt that we had gone too far with some of the details. We were told that rather than focus on what they called implementation details, we should focus on high-level questions of what the policy would do. Now, I viewed this as a way to strip away a lot of the protections we had built into the document, and my suspicions were proven correct when a few weeks later we were presented with a revised version of the policy and told that the provisions within it were as far as the Publications Board was willing to go. Perhaps most crucially, they had removed all references to comprehensive name changes, which extended to correcting occurrences of our dead names within the bibliographies of citing papers. Instead, we had to settle for a policy that required trans people to get permission from every author citing us before we could have our necronyms removed from the digital library completely. Now, it became clear to us that this was going to be the hill that the ACM staff were willing to die on. And the four trans people in the room ultimately agreed to support the compromise policy. And in November 2019, the ACM Publications Board voted to approve the first official policy on author name changes to be adopted by a major publisher. Despite our misgivings, this policy was a radical step forward for trans-inclusive identity policies in academic publishing. The ACM policy represented a reality proof. A major publisher could grant name changes to trans people, and the world hadn't ended. But despite progress on this front, my name still hadn't been corrected in the digital library. I shifted over from the policy working group to the implementation working group, where I was at that point the only trans person on a much smaller committee who would be responsible for all of those implementation details we'd been told not to worry about earlier. Meanwhile, I was still trying to get other major publishers to correct my name. After months of emailing editors and publishers and generally making a nuisance of myself, I found myself in contact with a sympathetic editor at Springer Nature, a man named Ed Gersner. Ed told me that unless there was a major shift in the culture of the publishing industry, Springer would never adopt a policy like the ACM had. But rather than leaving things there, Ed offered to put me in touch with a colleague who could offer me a platform to make my case. And so, in July of 2020, almost exactly 1 year since I had come out, I published this short article in Nature. I used my experience with the ACM policy as a case study to argue for the importance of trans-inclusive policies in publishing. And as I'd hoped, the piece started a conversation in the academic publishing world that suddenly put me on the radar of a lot of publishers and, perhaps more importantly, a lot of other trans people who were working on this problem within their respective fields. I woke up to find my inbox filled with messages from other trans people in diverse fields such as medicine, chemistry, library and information science, and business administration, some of whom had met with success convincing journals in their community to support name changes. Others shared their own struggles and frustration with the barriers they were facing. On July 22nd, 2020, the same day that the Nature article was published, I created a Discord server and invited all of the people who had reached out to me to join it. Now, Discord has been an essential platform for us as we've organized ourselves and as our membership has grown. Now, this happened organically. Because of the Nature article and the resulting press that it received and the ways in which it was propagated, my name often comes up now when you search for trans-inclusive name change policies. And before the NCPWG had a website, this meant that trans people looking for information about this topic would email me with some frequency. And whenever this happened, I would send them a link to the server and invite them to join the community. What this means is that what had started with a group of less than a dozen people now has over 60 scholars from diverse fields and backgrounds. But at the beginning, our numbers were small. Comparing notes, we realized that we kept encountering the same objections and concerns, when we sought to have our names changed. And this was draining and counterproductive for each of us to individually refute these concerns. I, at this point, had a treasure trove of data on the most common objections that we encountered, since the ACM had circulated our policy among the membership for comment before approving it. I included some of these on the slide earlier in this talk. I went through this data set and I did a simple thematic coding exercise, ultimately identifying 5 categories of objection that recurred when discussing the possibility of trans-inclusive name change policies. Objection 1. If we allow trans authors to change their names, what next? Can anybody revise any history they want? Objection 2. How will people find the paper if it's cited under the wrong name everywhere? Objection 3. Won't someone find a way to use this policy for fraudulent ends? Objection 4. Won't allowing name changes impact accessibility, break gender-based bibliometrics, and otherwise terribly inconvenience publishers? And objection 5, who decides who deserves a name change? Are name changes really actually necessary? And I'm not going to spend any time in this talk debunking these, because we've already done this in this article that I drafted with the other founding members of the NCPWG. This article laid out the stakes for trans scholars where publishers don't change their names, and systematically considered and debunked each of the above objections. It proved to be an extremely valuable resource for us during our first year of work. Now, there's this quote from Audre Lorde that informs and inspires a lot of how I approach this work. She said, "Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. There is a constant drain of energy which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future." This is something that I didn't fully understand until I came out and found myself in the position of having to advocate for myself and educate my colleagues day after day. This kind of epistemic labor comes with real opportunity costs. The time and energy spent performing it could have been spent on research or teaching or advising students or doing service work or writing or thinking or anything. Nora Bernstein describes this as epistemic exploitation. She writes, "Epistemic exploitation occurs when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to educate them about the nature of their oppression. I argue that epistemic exploitation is marked by unrecognized, uncompensated, emotionally taxing, coerced epistemic labor. The coercive and exploitative aspects of the phenomenon are exemplified by the unpaid nature of the educational labor and its associated opportunity costs, the double bind that marginalized persons must navigate when faced with the demand to educate. If we don't take the time to advocate and educate, then the conditions under which we work often become unbearable and unsustainable. And the need for additional labor created by the default skepticism of the privileged, especially when confronted with the experiences of oppression that they themselves don't experience. And now in my experience, this skepticism can shift to denial and defensiveness as people begin to understand their own complicity in these systems of oppression, especially if they are people who view themselves as progressive or as allies." The more time we spend on epistemic work, the less time we have to devote to our actual work. Either way, this materially disadvantages anyone who falls outside the norm. When the NCPWG formed, we were each individually experiencing this kind of constant drain on our time and resources. Each time one of us would reach out to a new publisher, we'd have to begin the process of educating them about our experiences, facing the same concerns and objections until it felt like they were all pulling from the same script. It was very predictable, the responses we would get. And so this first article that we released essentially consolidated all of our experiences into one document. By pooling our knowledge in this way and putting it somewhere that we could reference, we were able to reduce the amount of epistemic labor we were each doing individually. Because whenever a publisher raised one of the objections we'd already encountered, we could just point to the article or copy and paste the relevant language from it into an email. Now, between the Nature article and the efforts of the folks in my working group, we were seeing the publishing world beginning to engage in a conversation about trans-inclusive policies. Members of my working group and I started to receive interview requests, and more publishers were starting to announce their own policies, and the word was spreading in academic circles. In September of 2020, a colleague of Irving Reddig, one of our founding members, invited us to join a COPE working group and try and develop formal guidance for the publishing world. Most of you are probably familiar with COPE. For those of you who are not, COPE is a nonprofit organization that issues ethical guidance to thousands of publishers worldwide, including associations and journals, and helps to mediate disputes between publishers and authors. Now, at that point, one of the major roadblocks that we were facing was from a 2013 COPE case where an author had requested a name change and been ruled against. Many publishers we encountered would cite this case as their basis for denying our name change requests. And so our first order of business with COPE was to amend that case so that it could no longer be used to justify discrimination against trans people. We then set about discussing and preparing formal COPE recommendations for how to handle name changes. Now, at this point, there was a growing group of publishers who supported these policies, but there wasn't much consensus over how to approach them. We had been focusing so hard on convincing publishers that name changes were not just possible, but necessary, that we hadn't really taken the time to provide them with any high-level principles for how these name changes should be approached. With the blessing of the COPE working group, I drafted a document in collaboration with the NCPWG that collected the knowledge and experience we had accrued over the last year and outlined a vision for the future. The resulting article outlined 5 high-level principles for a more trans-inclusive publishing world. These include accessibility. Name changes should be available to authors upon request without legal documentation, unnecessary barriers, burdens, or labor placed upon the author making the request. Comprehensiveness. Name changes should remove all instances of an author's previous name from the records maintained and disseminated by the publisher. Invisibility. Name changes should not draw attention to the gender identity of an author nor create a clear juxtaposition between the current name and the previous one. Expediency and simplicity. Name changes should be implemented in a timely manner and with a minimum of bureaucratic overhead. Recurrence and maintenance. Publishers should regularly audit and correct new instances of changed names in order to prevent ongoing dissemination of incorrect information. These 5 principles reflected our concerns and our ongoing struggles with publishers. And as with the first article we released, they were written to reduce the amount of educational labor that we were doing when negotiating details with publishers. I had also been embroiled in ongoing disagreements with the ACM name change implementation group, and I saw this article as an opportunity to reinforce some of the specific points that I had been making. The release of these principles represented a tipping point in the global consensus around post-publication name changes. I believe it came out in January of 2021. In the months following their release, many major publishers released new policies, including Wiley, Taylor and Francis, Sage, Elsevier, and eventually even Springer. There was even a new article about the work that we have been doing in Nature in July of 2021, almost 1 year exactly from when I had published my initial column. So in less than 3 years, I'd gone from having to argue with every major publisher to being featured on CNN and the New York Times talking about the success of these policies. As of today, not even 4 years since I started working on this, there are 66 publishers and journals who have adopted trans-inclusive name change policies in the spreadsheet that we maintain. We estimate that as a result of our efforts, this equates to over 12,000 journals where authors can update their names, and those numbers are growing. The NCPWG continues to work with COPE to develop guidance for inclusive name change policies. We also have members who have been consulting with the National Information Standards Organization, NISO, to create a broad-reaching policy on author name changes in information technology. We maintain a website with resources for authors and publishers, including email templates for authors who are seeking advice on how to reach out to a journal or publisher about a name change or to advocate for a name change policy. We also have templates in the works for a sample inclusive name change policy if publishers don't want to write their own. However, in our experience, most publishers prefer to do this themselves, and since the release of the COPE editorial, these policies have grown increasingly standardized within the industry. We do continue to offer consulting services to publishers on both policy development and implementation. So the result of all of this is that since I first started this work in 2019, it has become pretty hard for publishers to ignore the need to accommodate post-publication name changes, although there are some holdouts, some still do. However, the second problem, the problem of the sort of nuts and bolts of implementing name change policies, remains a thorny one. Currently, we work in a PDF-based publishing ecosystem, at least on the digital side of things. Updating names on documents requires a person to directly edit the document by hand. This process is time-intensive, often involving multiple back-and-forth conversations between authors and publishers about what needs to be corrected, and then confirmation that the corrections have been carried out properly. One of my colleagues had to wait 9 months for the ACM to complete updating her 89 publications. And there are members of our working group who have waited for over a year since they submitted their request to the ACM and are still being dead named in their own scholarship. This is unsurprising when you look at what is involved in changing a single work within the ACM digital library. This document is just the overview. The actual process document spanned 11 pages the last time I checked. This means that in practice, any small change in the digital library is extremely costly to the ACM in terms of the amount of labor involved. This is why wait times are punishingly long and why, no matter how much I plead my case, the ACM will never agree to correct the bibliographies of citing papers that dead name me. The core problem is that very few existing workflows and platforms within publishing were designed with name changes in mind. At the moment, there are really only two solutions to this problem. Publishers need to invest in more staff, in resources, or they need to invest in new platforms or infrastructures. And I'm going to look at each of these. Now, publishers could devote more staff resources to administering things like name changes. To my knowledge, when the ACM adopted this policy, they had no plan on how to resource it. They actually have only one staff member who does this work. And they only work on it when their other previously existing responsibilities have been fulfilled. Now, in the absence of anyone doing the labor of changing names within their platform, names are never going to get changed. Thus, the ACM's name change policy, for all that it was the first of its kind, doesn't amount to much more than performative allyship. Now, the other solution is that publishers could invest in developing new infrastructures that give authors more agency over how our identities are managed on their sites. And I'll talk a little bit more about what these might look like near the end of this presentation. And to their credit, the ACM is in the process of trying to develop tools that will make it much easier to do this moving forward, but it doesn't really help those of us who have been publishing since we started our careers. Now, ultimately, there's no reason why publishers should be in the business of deciding how an author is named or cited. And there's one obvious culprit for the difficulty that publishers face when updating names, the PDF. Now, PDFs exist specifically to try and make digital documents behave more like paper, more like their dead tree counterparts. When faced with the malleability and plasticity of digital documents as the internet was sort of ramping up, the academic publishing world had a choice. They could find a new way to think about published documents that wasn't beholden to the limitations of the printed world, or they could stick their heads in the sand and pretend that nothing was ever going to change. As a result, the collective investment in the PDF represents a gigantic failure of imagination from the publishing industry. And this is something I will return to. Unfortunately, from what I've seen at the ACM, solution number one is a non-starter. And the costs that they've sunk into their existing platforms and infrastructures make solution two pretty unlikely for the foreseeable future. And if I were to hazard a guess, It would be that the ACM expected that the number of trans people seeking name changes was going to be vanishingly small, and thus didn't merit any meaningful investment. And I think this is a pretty naive assumption for them to have made, for one reason. Up to this point, I've been using the case of transgender name changes to help contextualize why our working group has been advocating for specific aspects of these policies. However, our success in convincing publishers to adopt these policies hasn't come because it's a new phenomenon for people to change their names. The vulnerability of trans people has simply given us a perspective on the necessity of these kinds of accommodations that other folks might lack. As more publishers adopt inclusive identity policies, the number of name change requests that publishers must accommodate is only going to increase over time. Now, I expect that as the possibility of name changes becomes more widespread and more commonly known, that eventually trans people will be in the minority of people seeking name changes to previous publications. This is because many of us change our names over the course of our lives due to marriage, divorce, religious conversion, or even just for purely aesthetic personal reasons. Central to the guidance that we have been developing with COPE is this idea that these name changes must be inclusive and available and accessible to anyone, regardless of their reason for changing their name. This is a reality that is not often reflected in our software platforms, and is certainly something that the ACM hadn't anticipated when adopting this policy. Now, perhaps it made sense for digital names to be unchangeable in the early days of computing. Perhaps this made sense when we were building systems grounded in the logics of an analog world. Perhaps it made sense when our civic institutions relied primarily upon names to track and regulate their populations. Perhaps it makes sense to treat names as unchangeable if your assumptions about name stability are grounded in the experiences of men who change their names less often than women in our society. But none of this makes sense today. In a world where names are indexed by computational systems, it's absurd that we still rely upon names as the primary identifier for any given record. Facilitating name changes in our platforms is an equity issue that extends far beyond the need to protect transgender people's privacy. Since beginning this work, I've had many women approach me with stories about having aspects of their lives complicated by their decision to publish under a particular name when they were younger. One friend who first published under her maiden name chose to retain it when she married. She told me how she was initially viewed with suspicion in picking up her children at school because she didn't share their last name. Another woman shared with me that she had just stopped reporting several of her earliest publications on her CV because they were published under the surname of an abusive ex-husband, and she couldn't bear to see that name anymore. Many women struggle with the decision to change their name at marriage or divorce, knowing that keeping their old name will have social consequences, but that adopting a new name will have professional ones. This highlights the ways in which the existing assumptions about identity that have been encoded within our platforms and infrastructures serve to establish and maintain specific, often gendered power structures. Put very bluntly, the reason this problem exists is because our systems are designed to accommodate the needs of a patriarchal, neo-feudal, capitalist society. In our world, historically, the privilege of having a fixed name throughout one's life has been reserved for land-owning, white, straight, cisgender men. Such men were empowered to mark their property with the brand of their family, their surname. Our software platforms were built with this in mind. They need to change. Now, if we want to do better, we will need to find ways to exponentially reduce the amount of manual human labor involved in processing and accommodating name changes. This means moving away from publishing platforms built around archaic print-first assumptions and towards platforms that treat the author's name as a dynamic variable that can be automatically updated by individuals rather than institutions. Platforms like ORCID already provide us with a template for how to think about this. In an ORCID profile, the author's name is just another user-editable field that is independent of the numerical ID that serves to identify the author as an entity to the system of data. We need to develop and adopt dynamic platforms that support the ability for an author to update their own name on their ORCID profile and see it automatically propagate across all of their published works and across all places where those works are cited or indexed. And one of the things that the ACM has been doing in recent years is requiring ORCIDs with every publication submission so that they can do precisely this. Such an approach would allow for more robust bibliometric analysis and tracking, and would also allow for greater discoverability of related scholarship. However, rather than dig deeper into the problem-solving space of how we start to sort of engineer software platforms, I'm going to take a step back now and take a high-level look at the things that we learned advocating for inclusive name change policies. Now, there are three key takeaways from this talk. First, it's important to recognize the importance of small victories when engaging in advocacy and change-making. Incremental progress is still progress. In our negotiations with the ACM, we reached a point where we had to choose whether to accept what we viewed as an imperfect, incomplete policy or push for a more perfect one that was likely to never get approved. We chose to compromise, and that imperfect policy moved the needle just enough that we were able to push for better policies with bigger publishers. Today, most publishers have adopted policies that incorporate the language that we laid out in our COPE editorial, while the ACM policy feels increasingly backwards by comparison. Still, it did essential work to open up a possibility space where there wasn't one before. Second, we learned how important it is to identify opportunities to offload epistemic labor into written materials. By consolidating and centralizing our combined experiences and perspectives into documents that addressed the most common arguments we were facing, we were able to reclaim precious cycles from the endless task of educating publishers. This didn't just protect our time, it also protected our mental health. Epistemic labor is exhausting, thankless, and painful work. Once we were in a place where we could anticipate any argument that we were going to encounter and prepare comprehensive responses to them, the cognitive load of that work became much lighter. And if there's one thing I would do differently here, it would be to invest the time and energy into translating our essays into infographics to further simplify our arguments and render them more easily accessible. And finally, we learned how important it is to think past the policy creation stage and into the implementation and enforcement stages. Now, in many ways, I consider the ACM policy that we created to be a failure because it doesn't commit the organization to a timeline and it doesn't provide any accountability mechanisms. Authors submit name change requests and then wait years for a response. This is because the ACM radically underestimated the demand for this policy and the expense of implementing it. But the lesson is clear: a policy is only as good as the underlying will and capacity to implement it. To close, I want to leave you with some thoughts about the broader implications of these ideas. In the NCPWG, we have started to explore the consequences and possibilities of new identity infrastructures within the publishing world, but in the long run, I believe that this same approach needs to be extended to every platform and system that maintains any kind of identity records. Mary Draz discusses these infrastructures in terms of externalized memory and considers how the rigid encoding of gendered information within our systems of documentation serves to exert control over people who might transgress against the normative social order. Writing about the consequences of a mismatch between one's lived gender and one's identity documents, she writes, "While for many people such documents are barely noticeable, the memory is sufficiently punishing for others. Regardless of how someone is living or how others affirm their lived gender, the past assignment preserved at this level can resist forgetting. The documentation too easily serves as a reminder. This memory, in turn, is used to either support or contradict the present. For those who are privileged by current arrangements, for whom the memory is more or less correct, these systems of classification do not feel punishing. For those who experience this disconnect between lived and documented gender, the reminder of the document and the persistence of a past assignment preserved therein can certainly burn." The work of correcting the names within a platform or system to affirm people's current identities is a form of what Draz would call resistant forgetting. She says, "Forgetting is not endorsed here as an abstract good. To the contrary, it is a specific tool wielded against an overdetermined and overdetermining past. Resistant forgetting therefore involves thinking differently, not only about how and why we participate in mundane everyday acts of identity documentation, but also about the kinds of punishments with which this memory making is intertwined. Creating space for people to update their previous work returns agency and autonomy to individuals over their identity. A necessary step is to rethink how our systems, platforms, and infrastructures might be improved so that they no longer serve the needs of some abstract normative order, but instead serve the actual lived needs of a community of living people whose lives they impact. Now, I argue that if we are going to live with systems and platforms that exert a kind of gravity over our identities, we should build those systems to serve the needs of the most vulnerable of us, because doing so will empower all of us in the long run. And that is as far as I have gone. So thank you for your time, and I'm very excited to have a conversation with everybody about this.
Thank you so much, Tess. That was incredible.
Thank you.
We are going to open up time for question and answer now. We're going to use the Q&A function. Q&A function. I said that correctly, I think. The Q&A function for our question and answer session. I do want to put into the chat some of our code of conducts and norms we'll be adhering to during the question and answer and the rest of the portion of this session. And I'm actually having difficulty copying and pasting it into the chat. So someone else who is helping me coordinate this could maybe help me in the meantime. That would be great. I do want to say that, thank you so much, Kristen. I neglected to thank one of our sponsors at the beginning, so I do want to thank the American Association of the Advancement of Science for also sponsoring this event. So now that I've said that, I'm going to stop recording